Good morning, Henry. How are you doing?
I'm great. Good to be here.
It is good to be here, but it's also sobering to be here. I was stunned by this morning's New York Times article, which was a report on a proposed set of changes by the administration's new leadership at EPA, which are a direct and fundamental threat to all of the principles, I think, that bind the people in this room together with most Americans. In effect, this is the 21st century version of a book burning. EPA is saying that all of the public health studies, future and past, that were done under present scientific protocols with protection of privacy for individuals will no longer be eligible to be used to establish public health standards in the United States under EPA's jurisdiction. And this is far more egregious than anything that I at least have ever seen before, because not only are they burning your books by saying the science on which you rely will no longer be usable for regulatory purposes and protection purposes, but they are particularly focused on books that save people's lives, public health studies that enable us to understand what we need to do to keep people safe. Have you experienced, in the years you were in Congress, do you experience anything like this? And how do you think, what does this say about the time we find ourselves in, Henry?
Well, I've seen many examples, certainly for this administration, but the Bush administration as well, where they just come out anti-science. They think science is just another political opinion that they disagree with. They ignore the fact that science is based on evidence, and the conclusions or hypotheses from the evidence leads you to a step for which you continue to examine it, but move on from there. But when I say anti-science, on reproductive and health issues, the administration under President George W. Bush said that they ought to put a warning to any woman that has an abortion that she is going to be unable to have another child. Not true. They wanted to put a warning label saying any woman that gets an abortion is likely to get breast cancer. No evidence for that. All the evidence is the other way. So they want to pretend that science that contradicts their ideology shouldn't be paid attention to. And of course, the biggest problem has been their denial of climate change, which leaves us very, very vulnerable. We could talk about the reasons we can be optimistic, but I'd have to say if we had another 4 years of this president, there's not a lot to be optimistic about. This, I haven't read the New York Times, and this is the first I've heard of it, but it's not the first time I've heard of that proposal. They want to intimidate the individual scientists. They've done this on climate change, intimidate the individual scientists and ignore the scientific consensus about carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, and how it's going to affect the planet. This is interesting that this article appeared a couple of days after an article, I think it was also the New York Times, that said that the estimates of the damage from climate change have been underestimated, that things have moved more quickly than in 1990 anybody ever imagined. And we're seeing the evidence of climate change and fires in California, storms, droughts, natural events that at least now are being attributed to climate change. For the longest time, we'd hear discussion of these terrible events, but the newscasters didn't connect it to climate change. Now it's clearly understood to be a part of what we're seeing as a result of the climate change issue.
I also think it's interesting that one of the regulations which is being targeted by this proposed change in EPA are the regulations which were put in place by the Obama administration requiring the cleanup of mercury and other air toxins from power plants. Those regulations in turn were substantially responsible for America's public utilities, at least many of them recognizing that the era of coal had passed and that the era, in fact, of reliance on fossil fuels was passing, because we do have a climate problem, we do have a public health problem, we have a water pollution problem, we have an asthma problem, but those are all really at their core, they're fossil fuel problems. They're the result of our continued reliance on fossil fuels. And I'm curious what you think when we look ahead to hopefully having a new administration in Washington. What do you think the most important priorities for the next administration will be in terms of confronting this nest of, well, I guess you could call it an intersectionality after the last panel, this intersectionality of problems where public health, damage to the environment, climate disruption are all coming from the efforts by some in our society to cling to an energy past, even though the energy future is going to be both cleaner and cheaper? What should the next administration prioritize?
Well, the economics of dealing with climate change are on our side. It is now clearly less expensive for renewables, and even natural gas as a transition from coal and fossil fuel burning power plants. If you're a business executive and you're trying to make decisions for the future, not just the immediate future, but down the road, you've got to start thinking about how to change your business model. Some are doing it, some are not. But it's going to be more advantageous for utilities to burn renewable fuels, certainly not coal. And it's amazing to hear President Trump talk about how he's going to bring back coal. Well, it's cheaper to burn natural gas. It's cheaper to burn renewables. He's clearly got his head in the sand. And so the economy and private enterprise and community organizers and state leaders are picking up the slack that Congress and the federal government should have been using to establish priorities that would push the economy further. But we're not going to start at zero. We're going to start based on what is accomplished without the leadership from Washington.
One of the things that's very interesting is that you can look at the great state of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma gave the Trump administration, his first EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, who had spent his years in Oklahoma trying to save coal in Oklahoma. And by the time he left, wind power was already generating more electricity in Oklahoma than coal. Scott Pruitt comes to Washington, where he spent about 2.5 years trying to help President Trump keep the country reliant on coal for electricity when it is no longer competitive. And during that period of time, the rate of retirement of coal power plants increased over what it had been under Barack Obama. And after Pruitt left EPA with a large cloud over his head, he then went and became a paid lobbyist for the coal industry. I think it's fair to say he'd been an unpaid lobbyist for the coal industry for many years. And they paid him to go to Indiana and try to make Indiana keep a bunch of coal-fired power plants open, which the utility and the manufacturing community in Indiana had decided were too expensive to keep open. And it finally took the Indiana Chamber of Commerce to slap Pruitt down. But I think what's happening in this country is the nation is pushing back, and Washington, at least the Republican leadership in Washington, it's not just the president, unfortunately, it goes more broadly than that, is resisting. So how does the business community intersect with all this? Because you've been doing a lot of work with them. How does the business community navigate a world in which, when 4 major auto companies agreed with California that they wanted to produce cleaner cars, the Trump Justice Department said that was an antitrust violation because they were depriving customers of their right to buy inferior vehicles? What is the business community? How do you navigate this if you're running a big business?
Well, I think people who are running big businesses are trying to make decisions on the economy just shake their heads. They don't know what to make of it. So much of we ought to be grateful that the things that President Trump's administration has put forward, at least it's been stopped by the courts. And because they don't follow the law. They don't care about the law. They don't care about the consequences. They just want to go forward with their ideology. And I think the proposal you mentioned from the New York Times today will stand a good chance of being ruled illegal as well, because there are, in the statute themselves, analysis that have to be made, checked, rechecked before any regulation can be adopted. And I think that would be the administration trying to write the law by themselves, which they imagine they can do because they think that the Congress is an organization that's not co-equal, but an organization that can ignore, even when it comes to the questions of how the president is conducting himself and an inquiry by the Congress under impeachment. But they don't have complete reign. They don't have free reign. And even the auto issue that you alluded to looks like the administration's pulling back from that because the auto industry doesn't want it. And it looks ridiculous that they should say California and other states can't have a stronger standard. If they want one standard for all automobiles, they ought to adopt the advanced standard, not pull back the standards for those who want to move forward and under the law have been allowed to move forward.
Now, I think it's important that all of us do the best job we can to make clear to the American public what these kinds of really very complicated regulatory shenanigans mean. And the regulations which are the target of the new EPA proposal are regulations which will save the lives of 100,000 Americans every year. So in effect, the premature mortality result, if Trump can pull off what he's trying to do with these rules, will be the death of more Americans every year than died in the Vietnam War.
Well, not only that,
what's worse, in my view, is that probably won't happen in the United States because lots of the states won't let it happen, and we do have the courts which will speak up. But by attacking the foundations of public health science, the administration is going to slow down progress in the rest of the world where regulatory standards are much weaker and where millions of people, according to the World Health Organization, are dying of preventable pollution problems. So, any final words for this audience about how they can get the word out?
well, that's a different question. Oh, I guess we're wrapping up now. But it will inhibit others in the world from moving forward if they see the United States as not leading. On the other hand, we're going to be the laggard, and some of the very profitable businesses of clean energy and stopping pollution will be in China or in Europe or other places who will take advantage of the huge economic opportunities to get clean energy and to stop pollution. So they may be hurt in their efforts because we're not the leaders, but we're throwing away our leadership in this country every day. Our leadership on health, our leadership on stopping climate change, our leadership in science, our leadership everywhere. And someone else is going to pick it up. I hope it'll come back after this president is gone and we get the next administration. But in the meantime, we've got to do what we can every way we can. I left Congress where I tried to get a cap and trade bill. I was willing to go with a tax on carbon. I was willing to do anything. And I said to the Republicans, you don't want a tax which will reduce the deficit. You don't want a tax that can be used to reduce other taxes. You don't want a cap and trade. What's your answer? And their answer was they don't see a problem. They don't think it exists. Well, that's, of course, the real problem we have with the Republicans who have taken this position and this president who exemplifies that know nothing, do nothing position. But there's a lot we can do. And when I left Congress, I went to Mighty Earth. And in Mighty Earth, we're trying to do more to protect the rainforest, use the supply chain, use economic pressure to get industries to use sustainable practices. There are things we could do other than just throw up our hands.
Thank you all very much, and use your powerful megaphones as advocates for public health to let people know what's at stake. Thank you.